Welcome to the Coaching Index podcast. Honest conversations between coaches, practical insights, knowledge, ideas, impact.
Welcome to the Coaching Question, a new series from the Coaching Index. If you've listened to the podcast before, you'll know that most of our episodes have been conversation with coaches, players, referees, and different people from across the game. Those conversations aren't going anywhere. We're still doing those. But I wanted to add something a little different, something shorter, something that takes one question from the coaching world and explores it a little deeper. And the question of the coaching question isn't necessarily to give you an answer, because coaching rarely gives us perfect answers. Different players, different ages, different environments, and different levels. What works for my team might not work for yours, and vice versa. Instead, I want these episodes to make us think, maybe challenge something we currently do, maybe reinforce something we already believe, or maybe just give us a question to take onto the field at our next training session. So, for episode 1, I wanted to start with something that I think sits right at the heart of player development. Are we developing players who can solve problems in the game themselves, or are we creating players who need the coach to solve it for them? Part 1. The sideline. Think about a typical youth soccer game. Within the first couple of minutes, you'll probably hear it. Turn, pass, shoot, switch it, drop, play it back. And sometimes you almost have to laugh because the player hasn't even received the ball yet. They've got a coach telling them what to do. Parents might be shouting another instruction. Their teammates are communicating something else. And somewhere in the middle of all of that is a young player who is supposed to be learning how to read the game. And I think that's where the question becomes really interesting. Because if I tell a player what decision to make before they've had the opportunity to make it themselves, who's actually made the decision? Was it the player or was it me? Because there's a big difference between a player successfully completing an action and a player actually understanding why they completed the action. A player can make the correct pass because I shouted the answer. That doesn't necessarily mean they've learned to recognize the situation. And eventually, I'm not going to be able to give them the answer. The game will move too quickly. The environment will change. They'll play for another coach. They'll move to another team. Or they'll simply reach a level where players have to solve problems independently. So surely, one of our biggest responsibilities as coaches is to prepare them for that moment. And I want to be careful here too, because it's really easy to sit back and say, coaches need to stop shouting instructions. I've done it. I still do it sometimes. Most coaches do. And usually it comes from a good place. We want to help our players. As coaches, we're standing on the sideline, and sometimes the solution looks incredibly obvious. We're looking at the entire field. We don't have somebody pressing us. Our heart rate isn't through the roof. We're not trying to control a ball while another player is running at us. So we see the switch. We see the player making the run. We see the space behind the defender. And our natural reaction is, tell them, switch it. But the player sees the game from a completely different perspective, and maybe they don't see the solution. That's important information for us, because if I constantly tell them the answer, I might actually be hiding the problem. Maybe that player needs to improve scanning. Maybe their body position doesn't allow them to see the opposite side. Maybe they haven't recognized the pressure. Maybe they don't understand the tactical picture yet. Those are things I need to coach. But if I just shout, switch it, we might complete the pass without actually addressing why the player didn't recognize it themselves. There's another side to this as well. Sometimes coaches feel like they have to be visibly coaching all the time. If we're quiet, are we actually coaching? If a parent is standing on the sideline and I'm not constantly giving instructions, do they think I'm doing anything? If we're losing and I'm standing there observing, does it look like I don't have an answer? There's pressure attached to coaching. And sometimes the easiest way to demonstrate that we're coaching is to be loud. But activity isn't necessarily impact. Sometimes the most valuable thing I can do as a coach is watch. See what happens. See if the player recognizes the problem again. See if they adjust and give them another opportunity. That can be uncomfortable, especially when we know the answer. This is where I think we can sometimes contradict ourselves as coaches. Monday through Thursday, we might talk about player-centered environments, decision-making, problem-solving, guided discovery, and game-based training. We design these brilliant activities where players are constantly presented with realistic pictures, and then Saturday comes, and we try to control everything. Suddenly, we're basically holding a controller on the sideline. We're moving players around. Go there, drop, press, pass, turn. And I've caught myself doing this too. That's why I think this question matters. If I've spent the entire week trying to develop independent decision makers, why would I take the decision making away from them when the game arrives? Isn't the game supposed to be the test? Training is preparation. The game is where we get to see what the players actually understand, and sometimes they're going to get it wrong. That's part of it. Letting players get it wrong is the hardest thing in youth development. Allowing players to make mistakes that we know are coming, you can see it happening. The centre back receives the ball, pressure is arriving, there's an easy option available, and you know what's about to happen. Every part of you wants to shout the answer. Then they lose the ball. Maybe the opponent scores. Now we're frustrated. The player is frustrated. But that moment might be incredibly valuable. What happens next? Do they recognize it the second time? Do they scan earlier? Do they adjust their body position? Do they choose another option? Sometimes experiencing the consequence of a decision teaches something that our instruction can never teach. And I'm not saying we should sit there silently for 90 minutes and hope players magically figure everything out. That's not coaching either. The question is, when does my intervention actually help learning? For me, that's the bigger idea. This isn't about coaching less, it's about coaching with greater intention. Sometimes direct instruction is absolutely necessary. If I'm introducing a completely new concept, players may need information. If the team doesn't understand the structure, I might need to demonstrate it. If there's a safety issue, I'm obviously going to intervene. There are also moments in games where players need clear, concise information. So I don't think the answer is never tell players anything. That's taking the idea too far. Instead, maybe we need to become better at deciding when to tell, when to ask, and when to allow. Those are three very different coaching tools. Sometimes tell, sometimes ask, and sometimes allow. The skill is recognizing which one the player needs at that very moment. One thing we need to think about is giving questions instead of answers. One thing I've tried to think about more in my own coaching is what happens after the mistake. Instead of immediately telling the player what they should have done, can I ask something? What did you see? What was the pressure like? What was the other option? What could you do before receiving the ball? And sometimes their answer surprises you, because we often assume we know why a player made a particular decision, but maybe they saw something completely different. Maybe the problem wasn't tactical understanding. Maybe their first touch took away the option they wanted. Maybe they did see the runner, but didn't feel confident making the pass. Now we've learned something about the player, and that information can help us coach them even more effectively. But if I immediately say, you should have switched the ball there, I've told them what I saw, I haven't discovered what they saw. There's a huge difference. There's also another way we can influence players without constantly giving instructions: the training environment itself. Instead of telling players the solution every time, can we design an activity that repeatedly presents them with a problem? If I want players to recognize opportunities to switch the point of attack, can I create an environment where they experience that picture again and again? If I want midfielders checking their shoulders, can I create pressure and positioning that makes scanning valuable? If I want defenders to recognize when to step and when to drop, can the game teach that through repetition and consequence? That's where session design becomes really important. We're not removing coaching, we're moving some of the coaching into the environment, and now players have to interact with the problem. They have to make decisions, they have to fail, they have to adjust, try again. That's what learning is about. What does success actually look like? And maybe this leads to another question. How do we judge whether we've coached well? Because sometimes a team that follows instructions perfectly can look incredibly well coached. They're organized, everyone is where they're supposed to be, the coach is constantly communicating, and the players respond. But what happens when the coach isn't there? What happens when the opponent presents something they haven't rehearsed? What happens when the game becomes unpredictable? Can the players adapt? Because soccer isn't scripted. We can give players principles, we can give them structure, we can help them understand our game model, but eventually they have to interpret what's happening in front of them. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between teaching players what to do and helping players understand why they're doing it. If they understand why, they have a chance of adapting. If they only know what, they're waiting for the next instruction. So here's the long-term test, and youth coaching makes this particularly important because the real test of our coaching isn't necessarily what the player looks like this weekend. We're trying to prepare players for environments we might never even see. Another age group, another coach, another high school, a college, maybe the professional game for a very small percentage, and hopefully a lifetime of enjoying soccer. Eventually, they're going to leave us, and I think that's something we sometimes forget about when talking about player development. Our job isn't to make players incredibly good at playing for us. Our job is to help them become better players who can succeed without us. That changes the way I think about coaching. So here's something I'll challenge coaches and myself to try this week. Pick one training session or one game and pay attention to how many decisions you're making for the players. Don't necessarily change anything immediately, just notice it. Every time you're about to shout turn, pass, switch, or shoot, ask yourself, does the player need this information right now? Could I wait? Could I ask them about it later? Could the environment teach it? Could I allow the mistake? And most importantly, if I don't give them the answer, what might they learn? You might still decide to intervene. That's totally fine. The goal isn't silence. The goal is to intentionally coach. So, in closing, that brings us back to our first coaching question we asked. Are we developing players who can solve the game, or are we creating players who need us to solve it for them? I don't think there's a simple answer. Good coaching requires instruction, it requires questioning, it requires observation, and sometimes it requires us to get out of the way. Maybe the real skill isn't knowing the answer, maybe it's knowing when the player needs to discover it for themselves. That's something I'm continuing to work on in my own coaching, and I'd be interested to hear where other coaches land on it. When does instruction become too much instruction? And how do we know when it's time to let the player solve the problem? That's today's coaching question. One question, different perspectives, hopefully something that challenges the way that you think about the game.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaches Conversations, presented by the Coaching Index. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a coach, parent, or player who may benefit from it. For more coaching insights, resources, articles, and future conversations, follow us on Instagram at the Coaching Index. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep making an impact.